So my name is Jorn Bettin. I'm here in Aotearoa in Auckland, and I'm really excited to continue this series of panel discussions, this time with participants, with some very familiar faces, Kim Crawley in Canada, and we've got Tania again. She was there yesterday as well, and we've got Seth in the UK and also Quinn in the UK. So welcome you all. Yeah, I'm looking forward what we can achieve today, building on what has been discussed and agreed to date in terms of international coordination on the topic of banning all forms of conversion therapies. So, Tania, do you want to make a start?
Sure, I can do that.
Introducing yourself.
Okay, I'm Tania Melnyczuk from South Africa. I'm the founder of the Autistic Strategies Network, which is a collaborative initiative, mainly education, but we are forced to become involved in activism as well. It's a loosely organized organization that does ad hoc things and pulls in people as needed. Abuses have become one of my focus areas, although it's not something I would have chosen to go into. It's like it's just a job that somebody has to do. I collaborate particularly with other African activists and with non-speaking activists. I also have a focus area on health and on the rights of non-speakers. And non-speaking people are very often those who are targeted with ABA. So amplifying their voices is an important part of this, but it's just an important part of their rights anyway. It's just that they often bring up the subject of how they were abused before we. I suppose that's enough of an introduction, and let me hand over to someone else.
Thank you. Kim?
Yeah, so my name is Kim Crawley. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I'm a cybersecurity researcher and writer, and also an autistic self-advocate who is very angry about all this like really serious societal ableism that we have to fight.
Excellent. Seth, yeah, please introduce yourself. Oops, you're mute.
Yeah, noticed. Hello, everyone. I'm Seth Benjamin. I'm 28 now, from the UK. London, to be specific. I'm an autistic animator, writer, and illustrator. I started activism about 4 years ago. We started off by trying to kind of create an art movement for autism. The idea and basis of it was the foundation of changelings. The idea, that we autistics have always existed in a sense. And we took it from there to try and do other bits. Unfortunately, kind of slipped through due to lack of publicity. But now the main goal for me is to try and make an animated musical about autism to kind of help, coordinate a new movement in a sense, and to publish alongside it a petition to remove ABA therapy from the UK. And my personal theory is the best way to go about removing ABA is to attach ourselves to gay rights movements and things like that, because they've already essentially moved gay conversion therapy. I mean, we can claim in the same way that it's of the same kind of variety, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Quinn, keen to hear from you. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Jorn. I'm Quinn Dexter. I'm the wrong side of 50, and I'm in England. I run the YouTube channel Autistamatic. I would count myself as a reluctant activist. I was heavily involved in the very early nascent autistic community online back at the turn of the century, and was discouraged away from it because of some very bad feeling that was going on around at the time, the Aspie supremacists, as they came to be known. I re-engaged a couple of years ago, creating the channel effectively as a form of self-advocacy because of circumstances I was in at the time, and discovered that whilst I've been away from the community, that the caca had hit the fan, shall we say, and things that were just on the horizon a few years ago were now very real and very scary, and ABA is one of them. So I found myself not setting out to be, excuse me, any kind of campaigner or activist, but feeling I had no choice, because the world is not what it should be by a very, very significant measure. And if I've got any power to help change happen, I feel I've got an obligation to do so. So here I am.
Excellent. Thank you. So then I think it's time for us to get started. And you all saw the questions that we discussed online that we'd like to talk about. And after yesterday's discussion, I looked over the list, and I think we've actually covered some interesting ground there in terms of reaching a consensus that this human rights-based approach is the way to go, because it enables us to focus on well, the reality of human rights abuses in countries that normally don't consider themselves to be abusing human rights. In fact, most of these countries pride themselves of promoting human rights, and I think that's probably I see huge potential there for this to be successful, because it allows us to engage with the wider public who at this point doesn't know much, if anything, about ABA and the reality of conversion therapies. So I'm keen to explore this further. So yesterday we also then started to discuss what kind of alliances we can build, and yes, the various rainbow communities, I think, are excellent allies. Beyond that, well, all kinds of disabled people and organizations in which disabled people are represented make for excellent allies in my experiences. And locally, and in terms of the specific work that I'm doing with the healthcare sector, I would add 2 further groups where I'm very active in building alliances. And this is, on the one hand, with indigenous people and indigenous communities. So here in Aotearoa, we've got the Maori communities that are remote, underserved in terms of meeting basic needs and healthcare needs in particular. And then lastly, also clinicians and healthcare professionals, because in that sector, the stigma is absolutely extreme, right? I mean, if you think it's bad in the technology sector, well, walk into the healthcare sector. So there's no shortage, of course, of autistic clinicians, nurses, social workers, and so forth. But we don't hear very much about them because they're all undercover. And those of us who can afford to be openly autistic, we've got a huge chance there to support these people from the inside. So I would suggest these are all examples of groups of people that are marginalized in their own way that we can collaborate with, and they'll support our cause. And I know several of them who are really strong allies. In terms of moving forward, and I think one thing that we also briefly touched on yesterday as well, if conversion therapies are banned, then parents, for example, may be looking to other ways to support their children, and building healthy support mechanisms is something that we, I think, need to do. The autistic community needs to be the primary driver in this context. And so yesterday I mentioned the Design Justice Network principles that I think are excellent tools for engaging with others outside our community when it comes to, well, creating new forms of supports for autistic people that effectively make any temptation to go down the route of conversion therapy completely redundant. So I guess I just wanted to set the scene, and I'll now hand the floor over to all of you guys. I'll try not to speak and think too much today. I'll just try and facilitate. So who wants to go first and pick up where we left off yesterday?
Okay.
Oh, carry on, Kim, please.
Okay. I really wish that the LGBTQ plus community could ally with us to combat the other form of conversion therapy, ABA. I'm pessimistic, even knowing that a large percentage of autistics are gay or trans or multiple letters along that LGBTQ plus group. Because I'm constantly bombarded with tweets, as I mentioned last time, like, we banned conversion therapy, when they didn't. They only banned it for gender or sexual orientation reasons. So I really wish that we could find allyship there, but right now I'm pessimistic about it. And like some gay people or trans people, etc., when you mention ABA, are hostile. It's like, no, we, especially the politicians, the supposedly leftist politicians, no, we banned conversion therapy. It just infuriates me, and I'm pessimistic.
Well, I think
what
we
you've
shouldn't.
summed up, I think what you summed up there is something which is very political. Unfortunately, politics has become such an endemic part of our lives these days that people take very political attitudes. We're seeing that in the them and us polarization right across the world. You know, I hear it in reports from the US, from Canada, across Europe, from Australasia. There's this whole attitude of that there's a them and us where politics is concerned. The problem we have as autistic people is that we're represented in every demographic. It doesn't matter whether you're talking gay, straight, trans. It doesn't mean whether you're talking black, white, Asian, anything. No matter what demographic, there are autistic people there. The most recent figures that came out from the CDC in the US suggested that 1 in 44 young kids, I think under the age of 4, they're doing it now, are diagnosed autistic. That puts us at about 2% of the population. And we've long estimated, considering the vast numbers of undiagnosed adults, that we're probably somewhere around 3 or 4% of the population. Unfortunately, because of the medicalized and pathologized history of autism, we are always them. We're never us. And I think that is the key to actually moving this on, is to show the world that we are part of us. We share far more in common with the everyday Joe in the street than we have in terms of differences, but those differences have led to the marginalization we currently find ourselves under. The differences may be very subtle, but they make very big differences when you don't fit into the norm. I don't want to focus entirely on the LGBTQ angle, but if we were to look at the history of gay rights, of the emancipation of gay people from being themselves pathologized and treated as having a mental illness only a few decades ago, I still remember the jokes that went around my school when I was a kid. Because I was a little bit different, I was called gay by people. Now, I'm not gay. I don't care whether somebody is or not. It doesn't bother me one way or another, and I will defend everybody's rights to be who and what they are. But that was the instant assumption, because I was a bit different, because I didn't behave the same way as everybody else did. Key thing, because I didn't like playing rugby, I must have been gay. But that was the only frame of reference these people had. You had to be either normal, gay, or retarded. That was basically the 3 labels that were chucked around when I was at school. Now, we've moved on a long way from then now. In general culture, being gay is not doesn't have the stigma it used to have, quite rightly. But whilst that side of our society has moved on to some degree, there's still a long way to go. We're still where they started. But I know a lot of people out there, but because there's such an intersectionality between being gay or being trans and being autistic, I know a lot of autistic people who fit into both categories, and they talk often of having acceptance from two different communities, but finding it very difficult to get the two to merge. We have this sort of issue with all communities we're in, though, that I'm often asked to do videos about intersectionality, which is not an easy thing for me because of my own circumstances. I am white, male, I live in an affluent country, I'm heterosexual, I sort of fit into that poster boy of the stereotypical autistic person. So it's very hard for me to talk about intersectionality from a personal perspective because I don't have a personal perspective. But what I do know is that there's an awful lot of people that I talk to on a regular basis who do have a foot in two or more camps, and getting those different demographics to actually work together has never been easy. However, recognizing that we are all part of the same society, that we are no more dysfunctional or broken than the same psychiatrists who talk about us would refer to gay people maybe 50 or 60 years ago. I think there is a way forward, but it's getting that across that autistic people are not broken, we're different, we have different levels of needs, and our needs aren't always consistent. What we do know, though, is that our needs or our differences are always in the same areas. So whereas one of us may have a particular sensory sensitivity one way, somebody else will have another, but we both have sensory sensitivities. We all have different ways in which we emotionally react and express ourselves. We also have different attitudes towards veracity. Some of us cannot lie, some of us can but don't like doing it, but all of us like truth and honesty throughout. So we've got all those things in common, most of which are regarded as being pretty decent personality qualities, and yet we've been finding ourselves pushed to the outside. Proving to the world that we're part of things already is a huge part of the struggle, not only in combating ABA, but in gaining allies to help us do that. I've just ranted for about 5 minutes, so I'll let somebody else take the floor now.
Do you want me to go next, or because I wasn't here yesterday? Sorry about that. I did not know there was one on yesterday. I only had the invite for today. Anyway, I love what you said there. Very great speaking, by the way. Personally, I feel as if we can connect to the two communities. It's partly about depoliticizing everything, in my opinion, and showing that we are all human. But in a sense, I think it also comes down to the nature of things. I would say the best way to go about this is maybe by a collective video or collaboration, which takes us through the history of human rights violations. We can show we'll take them through all the things that have been patched. We'll take them through Black rights partly restored, women's rights being restored somewhat, gay rights being restored, LGBT rights being restored, and then we'll highlight ones that aren't restored, ones that are still very much marginalized, ones where we have very much still been pushed to the background. And we could go there and take it to points where we're just talking about the autistic community and saying, our human rights are still being violated to this day through such and such reason. Well, we can say that we're either given the help we needed by the medical establishment as a detriment to our own personal health, our mental health, or we're not given the help and we're told to be on our way. I mean, we're either sorry for the terminology, we're either high functioning and we're not given help, or we're low functioning and presumed to be so beyond help that we're put in a mental assignment, at least in my opinion. And it's about showing this duality of nature between how we kind of function within our society and how society treats us as how we get through to the public, at least in my opinion. Sorry.
I think with what you said there, that part of the problem that we face is sort of encapsulated in what you said there with, you talk of high functioning, low functioning. Now, I'm sure you yourself, like the rest of us, are not very happy with the idea of functioning labels. The fact is they do exist and they're bandied about with abandon. Now, I know Tania certainly could have a lot to say about this because she's done a lot of work with non-speaking people. If one is unable to communicate in the socially accepted way, i.e. through speech, then one is immediately assumed to be far more dysfunctional than one actually is. I say I don't have Tania's experience, but I have a number of people I communicate with regularly who don't speak as a matter of course. They may occasionally speak, or they may not speak at all. There's so many different reasons why somebody who's autistic may not speak, whether by choice or by other disability, like apraxia or the like. But there is a presumption of incompetence on anybody who can't communicate in a way that fits the social norm. So even those of us who are labelled at some point as high functioning still find ourselves pushed to the wayside. I'll give you a good example of something that happened to me personally. I won't be vague about it. I've said an elderly relative before. My father is the only member of my family that I'm still in touch with. My younger brother is not autistic and is probably one of the most evil people I've ever met, and actually kidnapped my elderly mother 2 years ago, and we've been unable to get her back. But I'm still in touch with my father, and I try to help him where I can. His GP rang me a while ago with concerns about my father's health, and because I've been put in position as primary contact, next of kin, came to me asking for my advice and my opinion on the circumstance. I mentioned during the conversation that I was autistic, and his attitude towards me changed like that. It went from being very respectful, treating me as an elder of the family, to basically what I would describe as being gumped. He treated me suddenly as if I was a bit simple and I needed things explaining to me very thoroughly. When I explained things about the family dynamic that were affecting the situation, said, yes, of course, but people do things like that, I mean, it may seem silly to you, but you don't understand. Why? This is a GP, a guy about my own age, who is extremely well educated, and yet straight away his attitude towards me on knowing that I was autistic changed the way he perceived me, and he started treating me like a child. Now that's something that happened to me personally, but if you can come across any autist who won't be able to tell you a similar tale, I'd be very, very surprised. We've all experienced that. And yet there are labels that say high functioning and low functioning, which get applied to us without our consent, and they don't really work. If we're high functioning, supposedly, we still get spoken down to. We also have our own circumstances where we have days where we feel things are too much for us, but the society around us is not acknowledging that because we've been labelled as high functioning. You then get people who've been labelled as low functioning who are deemed as incapable of looking after themselves or having any kind of success or even having any quality of life. And this really brings us back to the theme of the whole discussion. ABA is based on that presumption of lack of competence, of lack of ability. It's based on scaring the bejesus out of parents into believing that their child is going to have an absolutely hopeless future unless they do this one thing. It's a guilt trip that's laid onto parents. And what we're doing in terms of campaigning against ABA, if we're successful, is not only to free the autistic people concerned who are being brainwashed by a really quite hideous practice, which, as we've just said, is already in the process of being banned for other demographics. We're also freeing the parents from that fear and giving them hope for their children's future. Second rant over with.
Your anecdote reminds me of one of my own anecdotes, Quinn. At this point, I am confident that a decade from now, or maybe a little after that, it will be considered like the concept of autism diagnosis will be considered as absurd as homosexuality diagnosis. Like, you should bloody well know if you're autistic or not, right? But I got my formal autism diagnosis a few years ago in my mid-30s. And I can relate to your life a little bit, Quinn. Like, I don't really have much in the way of family ties anymore, except through my romantic partner and his family. Anyway, my partner went to the psychologist's office who gave me the formal diagnosis. And I really wanted the psychologist to let my partner in sooner because I've got, my partner is the person I'm closest to. And no, he kept my partner in the waiting room for like the longest time, as if it's some sort of dark secret or something. Whereas like I'm an adult and I'm an adult patient and I'm saying, I want this man to be here and be present for all this. Anyway, when my partner was eventually allowed to come into the room, the psychologist said, now don't underestimate Kimberly. She's much smarter than you might think she is. And like my partner, Jason, kind of gave him a puzzled look. Like Jay's initially had problems accepting my autism diagnosis. He certainly wouldn't have dated me for as long as he did if he knew about it on the first date. My partner, Jason, is like extremely autistic. Like you will never meet someone who's as autistic as my partner is. I'm in a relationship with someone who's really neurotypical. Yeah, the idea, he knew me well enough at that point that the idea that I could be a little naive or not very smart was just absurd to him. And I felt very much belittled by that. And the psychologist was obviously projecting. The psychologist thinks, his autistic patients are not the smartest, a little naive, not 100% sure of what's going on around them. And so he was projecting that onto my partner, who was willing to accept me and what he knew about me without it being tainted by what the psychologist thought autism or being autistic was like. That's all I gotta say about that.
Tina, do you have anything to say about that? Because I think all of us have a personal answer and we haven't really heard from you yet. So I figured if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to add some things to the concept of, even if we pathologized autism, ABA would still not make sense. And, compelling kind of academic writing on that came out about a month ago from Dr. Elizabeth Torres. She has a lab of her own. It's called something like Sensory Motor Lab. I've forgotten what it's called, but she also heads up the New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence, which generally is pretty much in touch with what autistic people are saying and listening to autistic people. And they put out some really good webinars, which are academically highly critical of ABA because they're getting academics in to talk about that. They got Kristen Bottomer-Beutel, I don't know whether she pronounces her surname in the German way, but the one who did that study along with colleagues last year about the pervasive, she did more than one paper about the pervasive conflicts of interest, the pervasively really, really shoddy science, which pervades early intervention research for the last several thousand papers since Levas. You'll find here and there, you might find one which actually matches up with the way that other people do science. Otherwise, they're kind of like in a little world of their own. And because they peer review everything, but it's these wacko peers, who have no ethics. Anyway, so she put out a paper, Dr. Torres put out a paper recently, in which she just wrote it on her own, in which she took the gene databases, the Safari database, all these things that Spectrum 10,000, for example, as well as looking at, and took a look at, well, if you take a look at these genes, what diseases or what disorders or whatever do some of these genes actually cause? And she said, well, this one might cause seizures, this one might cause a movement disorder, this type of thing correlates with, and then XYZ, what all the different physical problems were. So I'm looking at medical model now. And then said, but this makes no sense that you're putting people, if these are the things that the genes cause, and basically they're identifying the typical kind of health problems that autistic people have, which are not unique to autism. People can have many of these things without being autistic as well, but these things are found in autistic people. and then sometimes then and their non-autistic relatives do. So if these are the health problems, if these are the actual disorders, medical model, taking a look at it, then why are you putting them into ABA? Because that's not their most primary need. They've got nystagmus, so the eyes don't move properly. They've got a cerebellar problem, so the lower part of the brain. That's going to cause disruptions in your emotional regulation as well as in your purposeful movement. The new framing of apraxia even is that it's no longer a cerebral thing, but possibly sits somewhere in the cerebellum, and that's where the new research around the cerebellum and autism is going. It actually plays quite a bigger role in many of our lives. So even if you take a medical model out of it, ABA doesn't make sense because it's not a match for this huge disparity of all these different things that people are suffering from, if I can use that term. So we can frame it in a different way. We could say these are differences, some of them, and the Spanish actually have quite a good way of framing it. They have a term which is used in the disability space, which we don't have in English, and they call it functional diversity. There's functional diversity among humans. Some of the functional diversity might come from differences. Some of it may come from injuries. Some of it may come from illness. Whichever it is, it doesn't make any difference whether it is an illness, whether it's a disorder, whether it's a difference, how you frame it. Disabled people still have a right to determine what works for them and to actually give responses and say, no, I've got to struggle with movement. You can't tell me that I need a behavioral therapy. So, whichever model of disability you talk about, the patient, if you want to frame it that way, needs to be able to have a say. And yet you will find that many non-speaking people, in spite of great disabling conditions such as seizures and such as actually even beyond just being susceptible to all sorts of other environmental changes, will still not see their autism necessarily as a disorder, because they might be talking about their apraxia as something slightly separate from their autism. Some of them will be actually identifying their apraxia as part of their autism, and they might just say this is a difference, and we're people who need more interdependence rather than independence. As well, actually nobody is independent. It's just that, as Jorn has clearly pointed out on multiple occasions, it's just that the world is designed around certain types of people. Now, to link up to, so ABA is bad no matter which way you actually look at it, medical model or not. You don't actually even need the social model to say that ABA doesn't make sense in that context. You just need to, if I had a disease, for example, I have lipolymphedema, which I actually do have. I don't regard that as just a difference. I think there's something wrong with my body. But that doesn't mean that somebody can go and grab me and give me behavioral therapies until I behave like somebody who's got thin legs. I still want to be able to determine whether you're going to give me liposuction or not. I must make that decision myself, and it's about consent. So the consent needs to be there regardless of how you frame the thing. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the LG. I can never say those letters in order. It's like me trying to say what AAC stands for, and then I get the things mixed up. LGBTQI plus. Great, I think I did it. Okay, the chances of having allegiances in that and helping to push for that in South Africa at this stage I feel are quite strong, because I started that conversation before lockdown started, and then these last 2 years took a completely different turn in what I could afford to spend my time on. But those conversations initially with the guys who were leading, the psychologists in South Africa, who were leading the conversion therapy pushback. And some of them were gay and some of them were trans and so on. And then I got in touch with these people through an autistic friend who is trans and who is quite known in the trans community, and actually worked for our major trans organization in South Africa, which is quite a trans support organization, which is quite a good one. So those connections are more easy for someone like me to make. And I expect that if I just have the time to devote to them, I will get good results. What I've tried in terms of going through the politicians who are trying to change the conversion therapy legislation hasn't been helpful. They just haven't been contactable. I mean, I used all the correct channels. I did all the things that they said. That part didn't work. But going through the actual activists themselves, I have good hopes for that connection. And the same also with the disability community. Like our panel from last night, for example, I shared that on Facebook on the Autistic Strategies page. And within a few hours, the coordinator of the Western Cape Network on Disability, which is a regional disability, cross-disability organization where I also serve on the board, that was shared on their page, as well as this upcoming event for tonight. So they're supporting what we do is other disability organizations who, you know, when I explained, I had a special meeting with my fellow board members just before we had all of our re-elections and so on, to explain the things that that autistic people go to and the abuses which are going on here. They were like their jaws were dropping. They said, this sounds like 19th century stuff. We had no idea that this is going on. And you would have no idea because the formal autism organizations are not led by autistic people. So obviously led by people who have, sometimes they're involved in these things, but sometimes they just have allegiances, or it's not their focus to address what other people might be doing wrong, because we don't want to tread on each other's toes, and then it looks like professional rivalry, etc. So yes, so I'm looking at allegiances which I expect will grow and will be strong. It's a matter of actually having the time to devote to the lobbying which is necessary among other groups. Third point, and then I'm done. Yeah, no, actually, you can stop me there. I can pop in other things on another. No, perhaps I should actually mention this now. What is significant is many of us are speaking from a background of knowing people who were in ABA, but we weren't in ABA ourselves as well. Or we may know something about non-speakers, but we don't know any non-speakers. In my case, I know quite a lot of non-speaking people who've been through ABA. I also know that what's happening in the really strong ABA houses is they're following the same approach that Ron Leaf takes. So Ron Leaf is one of the Eva Lovas's collaborators, and he's now still a kind of strong voice in the ABA community. And he's one of the 40 hours per week, as intensive as possible. He's even been known to say, allegedly, that he preferred it back in the 70s when aversives were still okay, and when there wasn't so much of a hoo-ha about it, when they were able to punish children more because they got better results then, and so on. So there are guys in South Africa who take his philosophy, which is basically that you shouldn't have any other therapy outside ABA for it to be effective, because it dilutes it. And if you must have some other speech therapy, or if you really do think that you must have music therapy or some other therapy, it must be ABA informed, and it must be driven by ABA principles. So that's what Ron Leaf says. So that's the kind of approach which some of our top ABA schools are using, that if the parent is also has the child in communication therapy, and I'm using that term specifically, even though it's called speech and language, because very often with non-speakers, AAC, for many of them, is what they should be having rather than speech therapy. And there are many good communication therapists or speech and language therapists who know that in South Africa and who are following that approach. But so they will be in that, and the child then starts communicating that there's abuses happening, and the school then says, well, the child shouldn't be in there anyway. They should be with us because we will make them speak. You piddling around here with things which are less than speech, keep them with us, and we will get them to speak. So pull them out of there. And that happens from time to time because parents are ableist and they believe in this, these people with these very strong convictions. And the child will then lose all communication access, basically, be forced into PECs, be forced into prompt, which is a kind of a method where they manipulate your mouth and until you will speak properly. And the kids who've been through that have said it's highly disrespectful. I know some people who've been in them and don't like it at all. But that's just remove access to communication, and then you can abuse someone as much as possible. That's where we are with some of it. But if I can sum up the previous 2 points, the chances of allyship, if we have the time to devote to it, if we can get a good enough local team together, are good in South Africa. Not so good in the rest of Africa yet. but we're making inroads there too, which I will talk about in another session rather.
The idea of ABA-informed music therapy is really absurd, dark humor. Like, listen to this song, or I will slap you, or take away your supper.
Sounds frightening, to be fair. From what you said, it's given me the idea. Sorry, we give you was that? Did you have something for the? Sorry if I'm interrupting.
No, that's okay. I just
Go ahead.
Basically, the roots of, we need to, I think, look at the roots of ABA. Why is it still going on? The main reason for me and why it probably is going on is for profits. It all comes down to money. So potentially there's maybe 3 routes we can take, routes. There's 3 routes we can take. One, targets at using advertising or some form of anti-advertising in a sense to target the places where they're getting their profits from, show the people there's better methods to go for their reproducibility, their reputation, use enough memes and enough advertising or enough posts to kind of show the people that are so alternatives and what's actually going on. And 3, potentially create new laws to subvert their profits, put like larger taxes on ABA, put make sure, maybe say that all ABA therapies can exist, but they must be non-profits. That would probably stop ABA altogether to say they can't make profit of it. But it still exists, but you can't earn money. That would, I know I don't want ABA either, but I'm saying if that's a method, say that it can exist, but not earning money on it. Doing that
I think I would be careful. I mean, you're then trying to basically stay very much within the established system and in a way just handing over control to the so-called invisible hand of the market. I think we are trying, well, what is so obvious here is the human rights violations, and this is something more fundamental, right? No market forces should be able to invalidate human rights concerns. So that's exactly the kind of culture that we need to change. In fact, let's, I've jotted down a few notes and I'd like to summarize a few things here. It's, I think, been fascinating listening to all these perspectives, and I think it's important that we communicate to the wider public out there the bigger picture here. People need to understand how ABA therapists and organizations doing these things promote what they're offering. Here in Auckland, for example, there are ABA practitioners that advertise their services to parents who are concerned about compliance. So basically, if you have a child with compliance problems, well, we can fix that, right? So I would recommend parents and the wider public to listen to this kind of language, and what that tells you about what's really going on here. Also, the concerns, Kim, that or the examples that we heard here about the stereotypes and, oh yeah, autistic people are naive, they can't possibly understand things. I think where that actually comes from is from the insecurities of neonormative people. So as autistic people, what we are is, as Quinn so nicely pointed out, we tend to be extremely honest. In fact, we get bodily symptoms when we try to keep a hidden agenda, right? So we really, I mean, and this may be hard for neonormative people to understand, that we actually suffer physically from dishonesty. So that also means that we are honest when it comes to acknowledging uncertainties. And this is, I think, what neonormative people don't get in the industrialized cultures in particular. And it is the norm to pretend that things are under control, to pretend that systems are working, and so there's this constant, continuous perception management that basically is the norm in our society. And I would suggest that's what's actually happened in industrialized societies, is that these norms, well, they've gone to a certain place where it's become absolutely ridiculous, where now I think 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 children, if you were to send them to the so-called experts, they'd get some pathologizing label, right? And those same sort of experts don't realize that their grasp of reality is so limited now that they don't see anything wrong with labeling 20% of the population as being some kind of not quite fit for the society that we have, right? I mean, this is no longer a working society. So, and this brings me to this topic that Tania mentioned. What I've been writing about extensively is that autistic people simply depend on other people in ways that differ from the norms that are considered normal in our societies. And that's simply a consequence of our diversity within the human species. And our society needs to start facing up to the diversity within the human species and realize that we're all terribly, well, not terribly, wonderfully dependent on each other. So there is actually something like a community. And I think one very powerful tool that we've got at our disposal now, since the invention of the internet, is the existence and the visible existence of autistic culture. Because our experiences, we are coming from very different corners of the planet here, and we all make these very, very eerily similar experiences. And we are able to communicate with each other, understand each other's concerns. We are able to collaborate. We see this in this campaign and in other projects that we're doing. Companies that we create and operate together. So there is autistic culture out there, and it's time that we tell the world about autistic culture, how that culture works, and how that culture is based and steeped in the enormous diversity of the human species, and that the rest of our society can learn a lot from that culture. And I think this is a very positive message that we can put right front and center in our campaigns, and that will go down well with a large number of people, because we're not the only ones that suffer under the current social circumstances. It's only that we are the first to often have sort of physical health symptoms as a result, right? And of course, mental health issues as well. So we are like the canary in the coal mine there.
Thing is, Jorn, if I could add to that though, that there is already in existence a stereotype of a realistic depiction of autistic people, but they're never labeled as autistic. If you look right across fiction, one example that comes to mind for myself is Star Trek. There are so many characters in Star Trek which people who are in the autistic community, people who are autistic or autism adjacent, shall we say, people who know us very well, see that there are a lot of characters in Star Trek who are coded autistic, but never described as such. I could name about half a dozen straight off. They're always depicted as kind of nerdy, not necessarily as emotional as the others, generally very rational. And occasionally they're the butt of the joke, but more often than not, they're the people who save the day. They are pretty realistic depictions of autism as it's seen in the everyday world, without there being additional disabilities or conditions added on top of it. They're never people who have any kind of learning disability or intellectual disability. They're always quite talkative, but nonetheless, they depict us reasonably well. We have a stereotype in the world of someone who is a bit nerdy, a bit quiet, maybe a bit insular, that actually is a pretty realistic depiction of a lot of autistic people. The fact that it's not being acknowledged as this character is autistic, particularly not if they're a likable character or a hero character, is, to be honest, not helping us. If there were more of us out in the open in the real world, you mentioned yourself, Jorn, earlier on, about the number of professionals who keep their autistic nature a secret because they know how much it's going to hurt them professionally if they do admit it. I mean, let's be honest, I mean, how many accounts do we know on Twitter or Facebook which are labeled as the autistic lawyer, the autistic doctor, the autistic student, the autistic psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever? These are all people who've got accounts separate from their professional lives where they can engage with other autistic people because they know that if they admit it to their professional colleagues, their credibility will be shattered and maybe their careers as well. We are there, but we're in hiding. And it's the fact that we're in hiding, both in real terms and in fictional terms, that means the real world doesn't really know what we're like. And therefore, when the abusive practice of ABA is put forward, the only picture that people have in their mind is of the very disadvantaged person who's never likely to have a normal life. Whereas in reality, most of us are getting on with our lives one way or another, but coping with the pressures of the outside world in our own way.
I don't think that angle helps us all that much in our campaign unless you have parents who are putting the ones that they call high functioning into ABA as well, which happens from time to time. But it tends to be the higher your support needs are, the most likely you are to be abused in this way. And that's where the focus needs to go back to. This is the problem that we also had when we had the Listen campaign. So Sia had made this movie with a non-speaking autistic person, and it also happened with the All in a Row play before that. There were non-speaking autistic characters with high support needs, which were being featured. A whole lot of people went like, oh, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. This is what we actually like. We'll tell you all about ourselves. But they were not non-speaking people. So they went and centered a different type of autistic person, and it didn't actually help the people who who were trying to make the point about the non-speakers, because they were like, okay, now we have to sit and listen to all these high functionings do their tirade and their protest in front of the theater and wherever and wherever. And we managed to swing that around with the Sia project to say, that's not the point. We're not talking about, oh, but Anthony Hopkins is autistic, and so autism is actually fine. We have to put the focus on the types of people who are being targeted here, and they tend to be people who genuinely have high support needs, and their voices need to be amplified in this. Not talking about them. Yeah, go ahead, Quinn.
So I wouldn't disagree with you at all there, Tania. What I think that the point I am behind here is not that. As you put it, people protesting outside theatres and that kind of thing. But my view is that if being autistic is out in the open more, if it's destigmatized in general terms, it has a knock-on effect. That at the moment we're still living with the idea in the general public's mind that autistic means one of two things. It means either you must have some special talent, but you're all right, otherwise you're a bit weird, or it's the high support needs situation where you're deemed as completely dysfunctional, basically, as far as the commonplace view in society is. If we can destigmatize the idea of being autistic in general, it reduces the ammunition that the ABA and other similar lobbies have got in trying to scare people about autism and being autistic in the first place. At the moment, we see ABA being used as a cudgel. It's a brute force approach to anybody who's labelled as autistic and maybe doesn't function in a way which is considered socially acceptable. And so non-speaking is a perfect example of it, but any other kind of co-occurring disability or condition could apply to that. If we can take away the stigma from autism in general, then we, I believe, help everybody. I'm not trying to say that, you know, to separate the issues. I just believe that autism as a whole has a very, very bad rep. And if we can improve on that in general, if we can make it a more everyday thing, if people realize that there were several people in their workplace that were autistic that they didn't know, that they thought were okay, they got on with fine, it would help to reduce the stigma for everybody.
It doesn't fight against ABA to take that angle, because what is happening is such as with the Lancet article on profound autism, they understand already, these people, that there are a lot of quite vocal people who have access to a computer who can say something. Now, a lot of non-speakers also are out there these days, and you can't always tell the difference if you're online between who's speaking and who's not speaking. But they try to, what the ABA guys and the ableist machine in general is trying to do is trying to take turf and say, like, okay, you high functioning people, you can have it out there. You can have your, oh, we're so good at programming computers, we're so good at this. Please, by all means, take that territory and go and put your voice out there. But give us the ones who have profound autism and you don't have anything to say about that. And that's the problem. So destigmatizing it, you may know some people, yeah?
I think this is why I see it as so important of us talking about autistic culture and explaining to the world what autistic culture is, because I think in autistic culture and what we are seeing online, I mean, you said it as well, you know, many of us are in continuous conversation and have relationships with non-speaking people or people who only occasionally speak, right? So we can show that in autistic culture, we are perfectly capable of dealing with all this diversity that the rest of society somehow seems to not be able to deal with, right? So our society is disabled in that it has unlearned how to operate with the human diversity. And we can present autistic culture as a set of practices that actually is able to offer supports for everyone. So we can model, we should show how we interact with non-speaking people and people who communicate in unusual ways that don't seem to be acceptable to others. We can show how that actually works, and that the whole concept of functioning is a bizarre concept, the way it's being framed. And I think this is a very powerful argument.
That is something that does actually work, because when you normalize, it's the same kind of thing, like, let's say somebody has some other disability, a facial deformity, something that is particularly odd. And I think possibly have come to mind because I used the elephant man as a metaphor. In the fictionalized version of the elephant man's life, it was basically a famous person, I think she was royalty, or she was a famous actress, who shook the elephant man's hand, thereby normalizing that you can touch somebody who is this disfigured. So the same thing certainly is true amongst ourselves. When we normalize, however, perhaps it was done perhaps more patronizingly, because it's not like she then developed a friendship with them and really they were pals and they did advocacy together or anything. But yes, we can definitely model that for other people. And this has happened in situations where people have asked the CRP of a non-speaker, oh, does he do this XYZ, you know, the same way that they often ask the wheelchair pusher thing. And then the CRP throws it back and says, ask him himself, you know, ask him the question. And then, you know, the people asking who are sometimes professionals are like, oh, they realize, yes, they're speaking over that person again. So we model that. However, that kind of modeling is not going to happen unless we actually really do that. I get questions like, I want to include non-speakers in my event. And like, it's free for all. They can come if they want to, but you don't know what the accommodation requirements are. Some people who don't live alone and do require a CRP, for example. And they might even say, what is a CRP? They haven't even heard that term, which is used by, in other words, a support person that has to support you, be there for your communication. That genuinely, there are many non-speaking people who actually cannot be alone for 2 hours. You know, they can't just, I'm going out shopping and I'm going to leave you here. Something could happen. They could injure themselves. They require that level of support, some of them. So if we ourselves create the events, and we can't just do that as an add-on. I found what works best for, if you want to learn how to have non-speakers in your event and people with very high support needs as part of your events, you actually have to go to the events which were created for them, because then you find out how it works for them. By just saying, oh, it's free for them to come, you haven't done the accommodations that are necessary. You don't know what it takes. And when we in the spaces where that has already changed, and it has, like events which some of the neuroclastic writers are involved in, for example, and I'm talking about, they have many non-speaking writers, so they have collaboration with them. There are clubs for non-speakers. There are clubs actually for speaking and non-speaking people to work together on making music, where the non-speakers might be contributing the poetry and the other people who've got better movement might be contributing playing musical instruments. But these are the things that are necessary. And this is the stuff which people out there don't even know that's happening. They don't even know that those cultural exchanges are happening and that we're actually part of this thing. They think that a non-speaking person has a sad life, living all alone with no contact in their parents' home, and it's all terribly sad. And that exists because those are the realities for people who aren't given the opportunity to be part of autistic culture. So I agree that autistic culture is a very much a saving factor in all of this. But we need to participate. Some of us need to participate in it differently than we are at the moment, because we think that we're being open by saying, oh yeah, you know, I don't call people low functioning, don't call them that. But you do not know about the emotional dysregulation that some people with high support needs have. You do not know about the types of additional health issues that you have. You don't know about the kinds of self-injurious things that they continue to do without being able to control themselves at times, their meltdown management, what they need, and you do not understand how they communicate. So you think you can just host a chat, for example. Oh, but it's reduced, you know, it's like Twitter, everybody can just type. No, there are many non-speakers who cannot type at the speed which you can type at, so your accommodation requirements are different. Those are some of the things we can get right in our culture, because it is happening in pockets, but it's not happening enough. And because it's not happening enough, we get situations like, oh, you know, you're making a movie about autistic people, you never consulted us, look at Anthony Hopkins, you know, which is irrelevant if it's about non-speakers. It's not the same. It's not the same autism. You know, we are autistic, we do have a lot in common. We may have sensory issues in common. We may have pattern recognition in common. We may have seeing the big picture in common. But we have some big differences as well in terms of our experiences. And there's a different level of trauma that you have when you have spent the first 17 or the first 50 years of your life not being able to do any form of nuanced communication, and where even your yes and your no was inaccurate because your hand pointed to the wrong picture because you were nervous, or because your body just took control and you couldn't get your mind to do that. Those things are things that many speaking people, in spite of also having a lot of trauma, it's different traumas, and it's not always well understood amongst people who don't have the same problem, or whose loss of speech, and this was a very interesting Twitter conversation today, how many of us are on a like level 10 speaking, and how many of us on level 0? And all of us said, we've all had times when we could not speak. We don't have this scale. We have a default position, like I'm at a default position, I'm at a level 10 speech, but I also have a level 5, I have a level 2 to 3 where speaking would be a very bad idea, but I can still push it. And then I have a level 0 where I cannot speak at all, but I just don't spend as much time there. Whereas you have other people who may be a level 0 most of the time, but occasionally they can do a level 3 where they can actually speak a coherent sentence or two. So those things, though, are different, because if we have occasional loss of speech, or even if we have selective mutism, which, make no mistake, is quite a disability to have, you still don't have apraxia necessarily, which is a whole different kettle of fish, and which a lot of autistic people have, and which kind of sometimes defines what autism is like for them. And those are the people who are being targeted with ABA, and where it's a problem, it's a different thing. It's not just a matter of making you fake normal when you're not normal, which is unfair. It's a matter of you actually can't do it because you can't will your body to do what they're trying to do in PEC and whatever. So the successes that go through will be the people who are better at movements, at body movements, and they will be listed as the success stories of ABA. Yes, we've got an X success rate at our school, and some of them, they're too profound for us to be able to save. They're not looking at why.
Well, I
Thank you.
there,
This
Tania,
was really good. Seth, I think, Seth, you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yeah, if you don't mind, if I'm not being obstructive or anything, I think one of the main pushbacks we're going to have, especially when it comes to kind of destigmatizing autism or trying to change the stereotypes or anything like that, is anyone who is well known enough or is popular enough, any celebrity that comes out, or any doctor that comes out as being autistic, will immediately be put into the same stereotype that, yeah, someone that professional, he must be very high functioning, he must be a genius. Anyone that is low functioning enough, or it hasn't got a celebrity or aura about them, will just be put into another category. It needs to come from the community. It needs to be an outcry, and large enough group of people with different like popularities, different reputations within the community. Need to come out at once and say on one official document that this is what we are and this is how we come about. I mean, maybe a form of a manifesto or something along those lines might be of use, or I mean, something, it needs to be some type of formal document or a declaration, I think, something that we can all put our words in and all have our point of say on, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense, Seth. I think many people have attempted to put such things together, and there have been several projects have been done over the last few years which all have similar things in there. But what we currently lack, and what Jorn's collaboration project is helping to start moving, is a unified voice. We don't have, if you like, a spokesperson organization. There have been some that have come along. I mean, ASAN's a good example. But unfortunately, whenever we do get started, then the machines of authority tend to find ways of undermining us. That's getting more and more difficult as time goes on, but it is still going to be a battle we're going to have to fight. I think what Tania was alluding to, well, not just alluding to, was saying very explicitly just then, is absolutely right. And I take that on board in regard to what I was saying myself, that if we're to get that level of unity where we can have such a manifesto as you describe, we need to perhaps have greater acknowledgement amongst our whole community of that diversity of needs, and make those spaces, make all our spaces accessible in a way that everybody can take something from it and can benefit from it. You're absolutely right, Tania, that I personally don't have enough of an understanding of things from that high support needs perspective. I know a few people, but I don't know enough, and I have more to learn. There's no doubt about it, and I think we all do.
If I may just link in quickly to the unity thing, just an idea that I've had over the years. At first, and it happens, even Autism Speaks said, a call for unity, it's like we're ever going to be unified with Autism Speaks. But that happens. We have a lot of bickering, fights with amongst ourselves, but I don't actually see that as being the major obstacle. People lament that terribly, like, oh, but we can never get unified because these people who were best friends and advocates together are still screenshotting each other's private posts and posting them all the time. And that's what the advocacy monster. Yeah, that bad stuff happens. But if we are, and this is how allyship and this is how revolutions and movements work in general, they don't always create one unified party that then becomes the new government. They're fragmented people who are united around certain issues. Once the changes happened, they all disband and they go back to their fighting zone. But a good change has happened as a result. And that, I think, is enough to hope for. When we do collaborations such as the one which we're doing now, there may be lots of other things that we can disagree on, and that's all right. We don't actually have to waste our energy on, I mean, there are one or two instances in which I'll say, please don't put me on a battle with that person because I don't get on with them. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that I don't think that they should be out of the fight or something. There are people who don't like me. They would rather not work directly with me, but they're okay with, let her do it her way because we're going in the same general direction. So the general direction, the general thrust in a movement is good. And here and there, we do need to actually establish bodies because that is how the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities works. It works through self-representing bodies, and we don't have a lot of those in our countries. I do not think that we need to have in every country one strong one.
I think
like
Kim wanted to add here.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to pitch in my 2 cents before we go. I think Tania and Quinn, you've been making a lot of great points. One thing, though, that I think differentiates my attitude from the attitude of a lot of autistic people in our community is I genuinely believe that a lot of our ableist opponents are evil. And you absolutely should not give them the benefit of the doubt at all. You know, you'll be a lot safer and you'll do a better job of protecting our community to just work on the assumption that those particular enemies are evil. We can disagree amongst ourselves, but we're allies, right? And I agree with a lot of what you said about that there, Tania. I remember in some of your Twitter threads, I think a lot of what you tweet about is absolutely excellent. And I have a lot to learn about non-speakers from your work and your experience. But sometimes when you tweet about Sia, you kind of like give her the benefit of the doubt as if she ever had any positive intentions other than being a martyr, depicting a non-speaker as needing to, you know, all that violent bullshit from her movie. Whereas I would just be like, Sia is evil. Don't give her the benefit of the doubt. William Shatner is evil. Don't give him the benefit of the doubt. We're good people.
Yeah, I don't have much
Autistic people that we disagree with on certain political points or whatever are not evil. But those particular ableists and people like them, they are evil. And giving them the benefit of the doubt just gives them the opportunity to harm us.
Thanks, Kim. This is beautiful. And I just wanted to say here, this is actually why I talk about autistic collaboration and why we have an Autistic Collaboration Trust. And the people that are coming together there are not only autistic, but autistic people who are committed to collaboration, right? And so like we're with people everywhere in the autistic space, you'll find people who are not keen on collaborating with others. And this is no different than what we have in the rest of society. But in order to form a strong movement and to create change, we need to focus on those who are open to collaboration. And I think the important thing to realize is that these people who are highly collaborative, we find them across all the diversity that we have in the autistic community, right? Everything from the non-speakers to those that by the rest of society are considered to be terribly high functioning. So I think we've gone over time here, but I think that's okay. So anything that we haven't covered, yes?
there's something that somebody said to me recently that stuck with me, and I think it, to sort of finish off my contribution, I think it's worth bringing up. We talk a lot. Tania mentioned earlier on about the medical model and the social model, and I've been asked, where does ABA fit into that? Richard is 7 foot tall and keeps on banging his head on doorways. The medical model means we will keep on treating his wounds. It doesn't work. It doesn't solve his problem. The social model says we should make all doorways at least 7 foot tall, which in real terms is going to be very slow and isn't going to happen. The ABA lobby comes up and says, we can fix that. We can make sure that Richard never, ever bangs his head again. Their solution is to teach Richard to walk on his knees. That's what ABA is.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Really well said. I actually think that should be an animation. We should get together to do an animation of that, because a lengthy thing, I'd love to do that.
Seth, but completely off the subject, did you contact me a while ago about your?
Yeah, that was me. Yeah.
Sorry, I never got back to you. I've had a ridiculously busy year, but I will look at that email and get back to you. Okay?
Oh yeah,
motion stuff, wasn't it?
Stop motion animation. I actually got some of my puppets from currently remaking. But yeah, that analogy there. If we can make that a 2-minute thing, I'd love to animate that.
I'll be in touch.
Oh,
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I think a key to what you said, I've distilled it down to there's one key ingredient without which ABA cannot work. If this were to go away, there would be no ABA, and that is ableism. You can't have ABA without ableism, which means that if you want to keep the money side of ABA going, and that I believe is, I agree with you, if we try to find root causes of things, money is the root cause of this. It is a very strong contributor, the fact that it's got such a big booming industry behind. But you still, to run that industry, to create that demand, to ensure that people are willing to keep working in this profession and to keep abusing people without calling it abuse, you have to have ableism in that mix. If we dismantle ableism, now you might say, oh, but that's incredibly idealistic, how are we going to do that? We can start creating awareness of what ableism actually is. And ableism is that thing where you want to say, oh, but there are such wonderful autistic people out there. Mozart was probably autistic, and this famous person was. That's still a very ableist approach to it. You need to be able to say that somebody who does have, and there are not that many autistic people who do have intellectual disabilities, but let's use that as an example, because they're usually the lowest of everything in the pecking order, the first ones to be triaged when it comes to COVID-19. So if we start flipping that to say that person is as equal, as valuable, as entitled to a heart transplant or whatever medical thing as anybody else, and we impress that, it starts to take away, it starts to erode. And that's just one example. There's a lot of other examples of ableism, everyday ableism, which can be exposed. It starts to erode the need for ABA, because you don't need to have people walking on their knees anymore. You don't, there isn't a need for it if we can do accommodations. And that's what happened in the gay world. We don't need to convert people anymore. We just accept them. And it was one of the things, the way in which Levas expressed this. He and Rikas both said the premise on which they are doing ABA as conversion therapy for gay people, as well as and gender non-conforming in whatever ways as well, and for autistic people, was they said the premise is that it is easier for these aberrant souls, because they weren't considering us people, to be transformed to become acceptable to what society says than it is to get society to accept them. And yet society has gone, not completely, you still get murders of gay people, but society has accepted people who are gender and sexuality non-conforming to the extent that there are laws to protect them, that marriage is allowed, that you are allowed to do things, that even the state, even if there's a huge backlog in South Africa, but that there are state-sponsored gender reassignment surgeries. I don't know if that's still the word. But this happens. So if society could accept that these things happen, enough of society that the laws could actually change, then enough of society can actually change to become less ableist, to the extent that, you know, you don't have to see conversion therapy as a need for autistic people. We shouldn't have to have this to become acceptable for you if you just simply accept us. And that is actually, when you think of the step, it's really, really not actually all that difficult. You teach all these anti-bullying courses for autistic people, which is so hard for people to avoid bullying through anti-bullying training. If you can just actually treat people to reach out to the kids who are with you in here, accept them as equals. You don't have to lord it over them and be their nice little friend because they deserve to have a pat on the head. You actually start treating people as equals and to stand up for somebody who's being bullied. I mean, it's as simple as that. Then that's actually not as hard a change as we want to make it out to be. Eroding some of the key cornerstones of ableism is not as difficult as people want that to be. But there's money which makes ableism very profitable. And without ableism, we don't have ABA therapists. We don't have parents putting their children into ABA, and we don't have government sponsoring it.
It was once said
you.
that the trick of a successful politician is to convince the public that society isn't broken, so we don't need to fix it, whilst the politician knows society is so broken, it's impossible to fix it. Whereas the truth is, society is a bit broken, but if we work together and we have the same will, we can fix it.
Well said. I think partly the problem is that ABA therapy and gay aversion therapy both fundamentally work on the association of love and hate. Parents love their children so much that they're willing to hate them and put them into an isolated thing. There's also the hatred kind of thing. Ableism comes into there as well. Society runs on a basis of love and hate. You either hate someone enough that you're willing to do something to destroy them, or you love them enough that you're willing to do something to destroy them as well. We need to find the ground where it's not hate, not love, but acceptance. And that can only come from an understanding among people. And that only comes from destigmatization, as we've discussed. And I feel like the only way we go destigmatize things is through a group effort or through enough appeals to the common man. We need to have people standing up in schools and saying things. We need to have it on the TV. We need to have role models and things. I mean, the idea of people need to be able to see themselves in what they're seeing on TV. We need to be able to have autistics on TV. We need to have autistics on the news. We need them to have role models they can look up to, and then parents can go and identify and say, that's what autism looks like. It's not this fun guy on the floor, and it's not the guy up there in heaven or whatever. It's the guy over there on TV, just a normal person.
I'll have to say goodbye now, guys. I'm afraid I've got to be on another call just in 2 minutes. Well, actually supposed to be there already. So thank you very much, everybody. I've been really worthwhile.
Great
Really
session.
Great talking to you all. I'm going to go have dinner.
See you online.
Lovely meeting you all.
I've got to go.
Bye.
Love your background, Kim. Love all you've been got there. Awesome seeing all the things. Lovely talking to you and all everyone else. But have a great day, everyone. Thanks for your time.